is a series of programs about children from birth to 5 years of age, the age when in this country children normally start their school life. We've called it the Springs of Learning because it's during these years that much can be done to help children to develop intellectually. A child with a rich and stimulating early childhood will take off into school life with greater spring, greater curiosity and confidence than the child who has been physically well cared for but intellectually neglected. Of course, in a very young baby, you can't separate off his mental, emotional and physical development, if indeed you can at any age. So in this first program, we are going to talk generally about all three aspects and outline some stages in his mental growth which will be developed in greater detail in later programs. But on this one point, everyone who has studied the subject is agreed. The first 5 years are decisive because during these years, the child grows faster, develops further emotionally, and learns more than at any other period during his life. Now, I have with me in the studio 3 men who can tell us why and how this is so. Dr. Hindley of the Centre for the Study of Human Development, who is going to talk about emotional and social aspects. Dr. Lovell of the Institute of Education at the University of Leeds, who is going to talk about intellectual growth. And Dr. Marshall of the Institute of Child Health. Well, Dr. Marshall, may we look first at the purely physical development of the child in these first 5 years?
Well, of course, the human body is changing continuously throughout life, but during the first 5 years, the rapidity of growth is really very striking.
Well, I wonder if you could tell us something about the implications of this growth in terms of the child's mental development.
The head is advanced in its growth compared with the rest of the body, and the parts of the brain and the nervous system which control it also develop early, so that the quite young child can move its head and turn it when it hears sounds from different directions. Control of the arms comes after this and allows the child to pick things up, to put them in its mouth and so on. The legs are relatively delayed in their growth as compared with the rest of the body, and so control of them comes last of all. But when it does come, of course, the child then has the power of movement and freedom to explore.
So I see. So each physical stage of development then implies a different stage of mental growth?
In very early life, yes.
How soon would you say after a baby is born that he becomes aware of the world around him?
At birth, of course, the complicated system of nerve cells and connections in between them in the brain, which the baby needs to really understand what's going on round about it, just isn't working at all. But nevertheless, there is some sensation. He can feel pain. He's sensitive to touch and pressure, which cause him to suck anything that touches his lips or to grasp a finger put in his hand. He can also respond to warmth and to cold and to different tastes. But all these responses are purely reflex. The baby can't think about them or control them.
Yes, well, sometimes it's a little difficult to tell what is a reflex action purely and what is a voluntary movement. Perhaps if we look at some film now, you could point out the differences.
You see, these are purely reflex movements over which the baby has no control. They're caused by the working of primitive parts of the brain below the level of the cerebral cortex. By 6 weeks, he's begun to inhibit the reflex movements and becomes capable of some degree of voluntary action, first of all with his arms. A bit later, the leg movements are beginning to be controlled in the same way. His ability to make use of sight and hearing also depends on brain development in the early weeks. Gradually, he begins to coordinate his body as a whole, but control is always greater towards the head end. This baby is the same age, but is more advanced and is beginning to raise himself on his hands and knees. At about 12 months, the baby starts to crawl. Later still, he's able to stand. He pulls himself up by his hands. Finally, he can walk, at first with some support, and later without it. Last of all, you reach the immense control and physical activity of the 5-year-old.
So I imagine that until these natural physical changes have taken place, it's really rather useless trying to teach a child to perform actions for which he's not physically ready.
Oh, quite useless. No amount of teaching or practice will cause a baby to walk or perform any action like that before the necessary mechanisms in the nervous system have developed sufficiently. We should point out, I think, though, that vary tremendously in the rate at which this development takes place. It would be a great pity if the mothers went away worrying because their own children just happened to be developing a little more slowly than the ones we're showing in these programs.
Yes, indeed. I think that's a most important point. And I also think that perhaps if mothers were more aware that you can't teach a child to perform actions before he's ready to do so, they'd probably save themselves a great deal of time and trouble trying to train their babies to, say, use pots at too early an age.
Oh, yes. You can't teach a baby to be dry before it's developed control of its bladder. When it has this control, then some system of catching and encouragement will probably teach it. You must avoid, of course, any system which involves scolding or punishment.
Yes, indeed. But do you think that it's possible to condition a child to be dry before he's old enough to cooperate with you?
I don't think you could teach a baby to be dry in the first place by a system of conditioning, although, of course, conditioned reflex systems can be very helpful to the cooperative older children who have been trained but who wet the bed at night simply because they don't wake up in time.
May I put in a word?
Certainly.
In a study we've been doing, 60% of children were reliably dry at night by the age of 3, but the other 40% weren't, and some of them wet quite frequently.
Well, Dr. Hindley, would you like to say about what age a child should be potted?
Well, there's no evidence to suggest that putting babies on the pot when they're very tiny will make them dry any sooner. On the other hand, if a baby sits quite contentedly on the pot, I don't think there's any harm in it. I think what is really important, the pot situation shouldn't become a great source of conflict between the child and his mother. If this happens, it may put the child off the pot altogether, it may make him resentful of his mother, and I think it's terribly important that the mother should keep good relations with the child, both to help potting and in every other aspect of life.
Yes. Well, now, just to return for a moment to this very important question of children's environment, Dr. Marshall, I take your point that a child can't perform an action before his brain and body are sufficiently mature to do so. But now, supposing that a child is sufficiently physically and mentally mature to, say, walk or talk, isn't it then important to provide him with the opportunity to use these skills?
Yes and no. Practice seems to have very little effect on the simple actions which all normal children develop, such as walking. More complex skills, especially those requiring judgment, such as jumping and climbing, and I suppose talking really comes into this category too, these do benefit from practice, and naturally the child's environment should encourage this practice.
Yes, I'd like to add to that. We are getting increasing evidence that not only the development of behavior, but even the biochemical functioning of the nervous system itself is to some extent affected in a general way by external stimulation. And certainly children who've lacked adequate social and physical stimulation can be both apathetic and backward in all kinds of ways, ranging from control of movement to mental operations.
Well, Dr. Hindley, would you like to tell us now something about a child's early emotional development?
Yes, well, the first thing I'd like to say is that all babies are different. Some are very lively and vigorous, they'll suck vigorously, cry loudly. You get others who suck rather weakly, they cry rather pathetically. Sometimes this is due to a difficult birth, but in other cases it simply seems to be the nature of the child, and they go on that way.
Yes. Well, Dr. Marshall said that a newborn baby is really hardly conscious in our sense of the word because his brain cells haven't yet had time to develop. When would you say his emotional life began?
Well, in a sense, right at the start. We don't know what his consciousness is, but certainly a young baby can be very distressed by pain and hunger, and if he's left for any length of time like this, he can get it increasingly so that he gets very, very upset. And if this happens, we don't know for certain whether this leaves any kind of lasting impression, but I certainly think it's advisable for mothers to avoid this if they possibly can.
But, you know, babies do go through phases of crying at night and keeping their parents awake till all hours, don't they?
Well, this is absolutely true, and all I can suggest is that if a parent's done everything they possibly can to comfort the baby, and if they're satisfied the baby isn't ill or something, at times they may just have to go to bed and try and get some sleep themselves.
Easier said sometimes. But anyway, I interrupted you. Please go on.
Well, I was talking about the very young baby of a week old or so. And another point about emotions at this age is that they're not really concerned at all with other people. They're only concerned really with the child's own satisfactions and dissatisfactions. You see satisfaction, for example, very clearly just after a feed in a baby, or perhaps as it's being rocked to sleep and so on. And of course, increasingly it comes to associate this satisfaction with the mother.
Yes, it would seem, in fact, to be the key to making good relationships later on.
Yes, I think in normal circumstances it is.
You see some more film of babies and their mothers.
To a very young baby, the mother is a source of food, warmth, and comfort. He doesn't even know she's a separate person. Gradually, however, she becomes his first social contact. If she's loving and interested in her baby, he's more likely to find the world a good place to be. Soon, often by about 6 weeks, he'll begin to show really positive feelings in an unmistakable smile. This is the time when, if father's wise, he'll play with the baby and become familiar to him, because by about 6 to 8 months, he becomes aware of the difference between people he knows and strangers who may make him frown or cry. Increasingly from this age, he begins to make social relationships. His ability to do so depends very much on his having had satisfying experiences with other people, usually the parents. This 6-month-old baby is doing something rather interesting. He's just been weaned, and though he will drink, rather reluctantly, from a cup, he still wants the satisfaction of sucking, as babies often do for a long time to come. From this time on, they begin to do more and more for themselves. This one is stuffing food into his own mouth, for example. But he's not yet able to use a spoon, and if mother doesn't help, he experiences frustration.
You see, you can't do it.
As he grows older, the baby gets a sense of his own power, pulling himself up to reach things, getting his fingers into everything. It's important he should enjoy his own achievements. If he gets a slap instead of a word of encouragement, he may not explore further, and his learning will be discouraged. Of course, the wish for independence can lead to conflict and tantrums. It'll usually pay a mother to avoid such conflicts so far as she can, and rely rather on encouragement of his own wish to succeed.
Come on, Julian. Tea time. Tea time, darling. Give Mummy that. Give Mummy that. Yes. No. You can't have it now. No. Come on, darling. No. Never mind.
But sometimes she may have to pick him up and remove him from the scene. It's better not to let the conflict develop. Children love to imitate and copy their parents' actions. Later they may take on the role of father or mother in their play, and both boys and girls identify with either sex. Increasingly, little girls model themselves on their mothers and little boys on their fathers. This is important because through it the child comes gradually to acquire attitudes and behaviour appropriate to his own sex. It occurs much more readily if there's a good relationship with the parent of the same sex. Notice how entirely these children are caught up in the role they're playing and how well they cooperate. In the first 2 or 3 years, the toddler's play and activity is largely egocentric. Even when he's with other children, he follows his own wishes, and there's not very much cooperation. But by 5 years, many children, especially if they've been to nursery school, are able to take part in group activities and to adapt their behaviour to that of others.
Those children really did look as if they were ready for infant school.
Oh, indeed. But we shouldn't overestimate the maturity of the 5-year-old. He's still got a long way to go, and in many ways his behaviour can be quite immature. For that matter, what adult is completely mature? We all keep something of the baby in us somewhere.
That's true. Well, now, Dr. Lovell, perhaps you'd like to tell us something about the intellectual development of the young child. And I take it that it is a fact that a baby has to, during these first years, develop faster than at any other stage in his life.
Yes, I don't think anyone would be any doubt if they stopped for one moment to consider how much knowledge and experience a young child has to acquire before his 5th birthday. In the earliest weeks and months of life, the young child looks upon an object outside of himself as an extension of his own body. But by 5 years of age, he has acquired his first elementary notions of space and time, he can use language, and he can reason in simple and familiar situations.
Do you think that a mother can help forward her child's intellectual development?
Yes, to some extent. Just as physical maturation cannot be forced or hastened, the same applies, to some extent, to conceptual development, or conceptual maturation, or the growth of ideas about the world. The very young child simply hasn't the capacity to grasp certain notions, and it's no good trying to force the process of development. It simply does harm because the young child becomes discouraged. But if a mother can recognize the stage of intellectual development the child has reached, she can greatly help him by providing good toys, apparatus, and situations from which he is likely to learn. At the same time, she will talk to him, listen to him, value his achievements, sometimes challenge him, and encourage him to solve for himself his own problems.
Well, will you help us now to recognize some of these stages?
Yes, the difficulty is that there are so many of them, but I've picked out 1 or 2 landmarks that I think will be useful.
From quite an early age, a young baby can discriminate between things that are sackable and things that are not sackable, and between pleasant and unpleasant tastes. A little later, at 6 months, he can voluntarily carry his hand to his mouth and explore unfamiliar objects. But though he experiences a bad taste, he makes no connection between cause and effect. And even though he finds the taste unpleasant, he continues to put the lemon into his mouth. At 10 months, he is more advanced. He now grasps that the lemon is the cause of the unpleasant taste, and after 1 or 2 experiments, he'll have no more to do with it. In short, he's getting a notion of cause and effect. Now watch this. This is interesting too. This 10-month-old baby is playing with a rattle, and his mother hides it under a cushion while he is watching. Once the rattle disappears from sight, it seems that the notion of it has gone too. But the mother shows him where it is, and he becomes interested. She hides it again, and the idea of the rattle persists. He searches for it and finds it. He is at the stage of learning that things out of sight continue to exist and can be found.
Come on, you throw some on here for Mummy, look. No.
The sight of the lace reminds Andrew of his father's shaving. He represents this idea by a symbolic action. He pretends to shave. This is a great step forward, because he can use concrete symbolism to stand for or represent events and situations which are not happening at that particular moment.
I don't shave. But Mummy's going to say this in there.
But note that he is not yet able to use words as symbols and talk about it. This will come at the next stage of development.
Andrew, do it.
Can you see how big the ball is?
Yeah.
Now watch it.
These are 5-year-olds, and the teacher is carrying out an experiment to test whether or not they are yet able to reason about quantity. Is there the same amount of clay in the sausage as there was in the ball?
Same as the ball. Same as the ball.
Is it? Why?
Because it was so fat.
They were both fat, right?
Now she rolls it out to a longer and thinner sausage.
Can you hold the table still, John?
Is there still the same amount, or has it been altered?
Bigger.
It's bigger.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's bigger?
Because it's longer.
Because it's longer. And do you think it's just as much clay or less clay? It's less clay, because I had it out.
When there was not great perceptual difference between the sausage and the ball, the children agreed that the amount of clay was the same. But when the sausage was made longer and thinner, and the perceptual difference between the sausage and the ball became greater, they denied that the amount of clay remained the same. Their thinking has not yet become systematized. It remains greatly affected by what they see, and they're still unable to reason to the extent that, for example, an 8-year-old could. The 4- and 5-year-old may talk like an adult, but he is unable to think like one, and we must not expect too much of him.
In fact, this whole process of intellectual development is a fairly gradual one.
Yes, in that film, the child was organizing his experience and adapting to his environment, which, after all, is what intelligence consists of. From the end of the first month of life onwards, there is an increase in the number and variety of actions that the young child can perform, and he is gradually able to coordinate these actions into more complex forms of behavior.
Yes, we shall be going into that in greater detail in our next program.
Then between 18 months and 2 years of age, the child has sufficient grasp of relationships in simple situations to be able to tell in advance which actions will succeed and which will not. And around about the second birthday, that other great advance, which we saw just now, takes place, and the child can use language to represent or stand for persons, objects, or situations no longer present. And from that age onwards, he has to rework, as it were, all that he did before this age using language. And by 4 years of age, he has become intensely interested in his environment and constantly asks questions about it.
Constantly. That can become a bit much at times, can't it? But I would think that he has the right to expect an answer to those questions.
Yes, indeed, and he has a right to expect truthful answers insofar as he can understand them. Parents and other adults can help children of all ages by providing good play and other situations, by using a good pattern of adult speech, by answering questions, and by helping children to find solutions to their problems.
Well, now, one final question, and that is, are you all agreed on the point that these first 5 years of the child's life are of paramount importance?
Oh yes, certainly. At this time the child is going through great physical changes over which we have no control, so we must try and understand the natural sequence of events if we're to help the child to derive the maximum benefit from these changes, not only physically but emotionally and socially as well.
Dr. Hindley?
Well, it often isn't realised just how much has happened by the time a child starts school. And already by 5 years, children can be handicapped by emotional insecurity, lack of environmental stimulus, or lack of opportunity.
Dr. Lovell?
I agree with what has been said. When children come from homes where there is intellectual stimulation and where they can play with other children, their needs may well be catered for satisfactorily. But when children are seriously deprived of intellectual and emotional stimulation, I believe that some compensatory environment should be provided, if possible, even before 2 years of age.
Well, of course, the purpose of these programs is to try to help mothers to provide their children with the proper kind of stimulus. Well, thank you very much indeed, all of you, for your assistance. And now to sum up. Children vary very much in their rates of development, and there's no need for anxiety if they develop a little slower in some directions than in others. A child's understanding should not be forced, but if parents can learn to recognize the stages of development through which all children pass, they can greatly assist this development by meeting their needs in the right way at the right time. Now, in the programs which follow, we shall be studying each year of the child's life in greater detail, starting next week with the first year of the child's life, and we hope to offer some suggestions as to the kind of toys and playthings that would assist his development.